He was 19 and broke. No house, no truck, no money in the bank. Just a brown leather satchel, a brown duck Carhartt chore coat, and his grandfather's pocket-sized leather photo album in the inside left chest pocket of his coat, against his heart. And with $5 he bought an abandoned Dory builder's boat shop on the small harbor cove of Lanesville, Massachusetts, on the rocky northern shore of Cape Ann, just up the coast from Gloucester. The town clerk told him the place hadn't been worked since 1971. The harbor master told him the seaward launching doors had not opened in 54 years, and the launching ramp would need to be redecked before any boat could slide back into the water. The old Sicilian sailmaker who ran the small loft above the chandlery on the town wharf, who knew the boat shop because his own father had ordered 3 dories from it in the 1940s, told him plainly that nobody had wanted that boat shop for 54 years, and nobody would want it now. But what nobody knew was that behind a hinged false panel inside the long wooden lofting bench bolted to the wall of the shop, in a small cedar tool chest that had not been opened since the year the last Dory of Lanesville had slid out the seaward doors, was something that would change his life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this bring you comfort, you might want to know that we have a small community here on the channel. It's called a membership, and it's a simple way to support the stories we tell. It's never required, but if you've been watching for a while and these stories mean something to you, it means the world to us. There's a join button right below this video. His name was Vincenzo Esposito. Vince to everyone except his grandmother. And he had grown up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, in a small 2-story shingled house on a steep, narrow street 4 blocks above the inner harbor. His father, Joseph Esposito, had been a Gloucester fisherman, the 3rd generation of his family to work a boat out of that harbor. His mother, Donatella, had been a hairdresser at a small shop on Main Street. His father's people had come over from a small fishing village outside Palermo, in Sicily, in 1923, when his father's grandfather had been 17 years old. His mother's people had come over from Naples in 1908. The Italian community of Gloucester had been built 1 boat and 1 bakery at a time across the early decades of the 20th century. And by the time Vince was born, the city's St. Peter's Fiesta, the Italian-American festival of fishing, had been running every summer since 1927 without missing a year. Vince was the eldest of 3. His sisters Marisa and Julia were 13 and 10 when this story begins. The Esposito household had been small and warm and noisy, full of the smells of his mother's gravy on Sunday afternoons, and his father's wet boots in the front hall and the morning sound of marine radio coming through the kitchen wall. Joseph Esposito had owned a 38-foot wooden dragger called the Donatella II, named for Vince's mother. He had bought her in 2011 with 23 years of saved earnings and a small loan from his uncle. He had worked her hard for 13 years. The boat had been the family's life, the income that paid the mortgage, the school clothes, the modest annual week the Espositos took at a rented cottage on Plum Island in August. The catch quotas had begun tightening in 2019 and had tightened harder in 2022 and 2023. Joseph had begun missing payments on the boat note in early 2024, in the middle of Vince's junior year of high school. The bank had been patient for a year. The bank had not been patient after. The Donatella de Setu had been repossessed on a Wednesday morning in March of Vince's senior year. Joseph had not gone to work since. The savings had run out by August. The mortgage on the small Gloucester house had been 6 months in arrears by October. The house had been sold at the end of October. Joseph and Donatella and the 2 younger girls had moved into the unfinished basement of Joseph's brother Salvatore's small house in Revere, 15 miles south of Gloucester, in November of Vince's senior year. There had not been room for Vince. The basement had 2 rooms, one for the parents, one for the girls. Vince had told his mother on a quiet Tuesday morning before they left for Revere that he would stay in Gloucester and finish high school. He had not said the word stay. He had said the word manage. She had understood. He had finished his senior year working 2 restaurant jobs, bussing tables at a Greek restaurant on the boulevard and washing dishes at an Italian-American place near the Fisherman's Memorial, and sleeping on a fold-out couch in the back room of an apartment shared by 3 older line cooks who had kindly let him stay for $50 a week. He had graduated in June with no money, no plan, and a community college acceptance letter he could not afford to use. For the 4 months after graduation, he had kept the same 2 jobs and the same fold-out couch. He had ridden the bus down to Revere every other Sunday to see his family. He had brought his sisters small things, a paperback book, a hair clip, a small bag of his mother's favorite Pignoli cookies from a bakery on Main Street, and had eaten Sunday dinner at the small kitchen table of his uncle's house and had ridden the bus back to Gloucester at 9. His parents had asked him every visit how he was managing. He had told them every visit that he was managing fine. In late October, the line cooks had told him gently that one of their cousins from the Azores was coming over and would need the fold-out couch. Vince had thanked them. He had moved his small duffel of clothes into a coin-operated locker at the YMCA and had begun looking for a different place to sleep. It was a man named Tony Calabrese who, on a quiet Thursday afternoon in early November, had quietly offered him another option. Tony was 78 years old, a retired Italian-American sailmaker who ran a small sail loft above a marine chandlery on the Lanesville town wharf, 8 miles north of Gloucester. He had been the principal sailmaker for the Gloucester schooner fleet for 31 years before the schooner trade had shrunk in the 1990s. He had run the loft alone since 2007. He had known Vince's grandfather, Salvatore Esposito, since both men had been 23 years old, and he had eaten Sunday dinner at the Esposito house every Christmas Eve from 1972 until Salvatore's death in 2014. Tony had been at the Italian-American restaurant, where Vince washed dishes that Thursday afternoon, eating a quiet late lunch alone at the bar. He had watched Vince come out of the kitchen to clear a six-top and had recognized him by the line of his shoulders and the way he carried his head. Exactly the way Salvatore had carried his. Tony had finished his coffee. He had walked out to his old red Toyota truck. He had driven back to the loft and had sat at his sailmaker's bench for the rest of the afternoon, thinking about how to do this properly. The next morning, Tony had come back to the restaurant at the start of Vince's shift and had asked the manager if he could have 10 minutes with the boy. The manager had been a kind, older Greek man who had recognized Tony's name and had said yes. Tony had taken Vince out onto the back loading dock. He had said, "I knew your grandfather Salvatore for 42 years. He was my closest friend. I have a small loft up in Lanesville with a back room and a folding cot. There is no rent. Come up tonight. Bring whatever you have. We will talk about the rest in the morning." Vince had not trusted his voice, so he had not spoken. He had only nodded. Tony had let him sleep in the back room of the sail loft that night. He had let him stay 7 weeks. Vince worked off the rent, sweeping, sorting brass grommets and bolts of canvas, fetching coffee and pastries from the small bakery on the wharf, and slowly, carefully, learning at Tony's elbow how a sail was lofted on the wide wooden floor with chalk and a long batten, and how the seams were stitched on the heavy old Singer sail machine that Tony had been running since 1971. Tony paid him $120 a week in cash, and never once asked about the months between Joseph Esposito's boat being repossessed and the day Tony had walked into the restaurant on Main Street. It was Tony who told him about the Boatshop. It was the 6th week. They had been sitting on stools at the long sailmaker's bench, drinking coffee at 3 in the afternoon, while a slow December rain came down on the wharf. Tony had been reading the legal notices in the back of the Gloucester Daily Times, the way old men do. Tony had said. What? Town's selling the old Marino place, down at the cove, $5 plus $612 in back taxes. Nobody's bid on it in 24 years. Vince had set his coffee down. Marino? Sally Marino's Boatshop, last working Dory builder in Lanesville. Came over from outside Palermo in 21, same year your father's grandfather. Built dories alone in that shop from 1925 until 1971 when his hands gave out. Lived to 92, died in 95. The town's owned the shop since 01. What's a dory? Tony had looked at him over the top of his reading glasses for a long moment. Then he had said, I'll tell you on the way. The town clerk's office in Lanesville was a small white wooden building behind the post office. The clerk was a man in his early 60s named Henry Di Benedetto, with bifocals and a careful way of speaking that softened slightly when Tony walked in beside Vince. You sure about this, son? Yes, sir. It's been condemned for 9 years. Yes, sir. There's no power. The launching doors haven't opened in 54 years. The harbor side wall leaks in 3 places. Yes, sir. Henry had looked at him a long moment. Then he had picked up the rubber stamp. $617. Vince had set $5 in folded bills, the 43 he had kept in his sock since he had sold his graduation watch in August, and the rest in cash he had earned at the Greek restaurant and the sail loft on the counter. Henry had counted it, stamped the deed, signed it in 2 places, and slid him an iron key on a faded green ribbon. Welcome to Lanesville, Henry had said. Tony drove him out to the cove that afternoon. The boat shop sat right at the waterline of the small harbor cove, on a low cobblestone wharf that ran along the eastern edge of the village. From the wharf, it looked like a long, low shingle and clapboard building that someone had set down on the harbor 100 years ago and walked away from. About 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. Cedar shingles silvered to driftwood gray. White-painted clapboard trim peeling along the corners. A steeply pitched cedar shake roof patched with rust-streaked tin. 3 tall multi-pane windows along the landward side, most of the glass broken. A single hinged side door warped and slightly ajar. And at the seaward end of the building, 2 heavy double-leaf wooden launching doors painted a fading dark green, sagging on their iron hinges, half open onto a wooden launching ramp running down to the granite-rimmed water. A small, weathered, hand-painted sign above the side door read only the faded word Dory's. The rest of the lettering long, weathered, illegible. Vince stood on the cobblestone wharf for a long time before he walked to the door. The first thing he noticed inside was the smell. 60 years of cedar planking and pine plane shavings and faint linseed oil, and the deeper, older smell of pitch and oakum and salt-cured wood. The second thing he noticed was how much was still inside. The shop was a single long room, 50 feet by 20, the ceiling rising 12 feet at the peak with exposed pine rafters. Along the harbor side wall ran a long, flat wooden lofting bench. 28 feet of clear, unjointed pine planks bolted into the wall studs, 6 feet wide and 3 feet off the floor. where every Dory pattern had been drawn full scale before construction began. Dory half-models hung in a careful row along the inland wall, 23 of them, each one a hand-carved miniature of the right-hand side of a hull, painted white below the waterline and varnished above. A long sawhorse with a partly built dory still on it stood in the middle of the floor, the planking of the bottom and the first 3 strakes still intact, 60 years of dust on the unfinished hull. A rack of wooden hand planes, block planes, jack planes, a long jointer, hung above the workbench against the inland wall. Vince set his satchel on the workbench. He turned in a slow circle. He pressed his palm against the lofting bench. The pine was sound. The roof had a few small leaks that had stained the floor below them, but the floor joists were still solid. He took the leather photo album out of the inside left pocket of his coat. He opened it carefully to the first page. His grandfather Salvatore, at 26, on the deck of a small wooden boat, mending a net. He set the album on the lofting bench beside him. He went to look at the lofting bench's planks. He had not been looking for a hidden compartment. He had only been running his hand along the seam where the bench met the wall, in the way of a young man looking at a piece of furniture he had just inherited. 2/3 of the way along the bench, his fingers stopped on a section of the front edge that did not feel like the rest. The grain ran perpendicular instead of parallel. A small brass hinge, almost invisible under 60 years of pine dust, sat flush at the top of the panel. He thumbed the panel gently. It was a hinged false front, a long shallow drawer disguised as part of the bench's edge, swinging downward on the brass hinge. He worked his fingers carefully into the seam, the way a man opens a thing he is not certain he wants to open. The panel swung down. In the long shallow space behind the hinged front, he found 3 things. The first thing was a small cedar tool chest, no larger than a shoebox. The hasp was rusted shut, but the lock had long since failed. He worked it open with the tip of a wood chisel from the rack above the workbench. Inside, in tight bundles wrapped in oiled brown paper and tied with sailmaker's twine, was money. Old American bills, mostly 10s and 20s and 50s, the small format kind printed before 1928, and the larger format kind printed between 1928 and 1971. He counted them later on the lofting bench by the light of the kerosene lantern Tony had given him. The total came to $38,200 even. The second thing was a leather-bound book, hand-bound, thick, the spine cracked and restitched with sailmaker's twine. Inside, in fountain pen ink that had faded to deep brown, was every Dory Salvatore Marino had built from May of 1925 to October of 1971. The customer, the boat's intended use, the wood used, the price, and beneath each entry a small, careful pencil drawing of the Dory's lines drawn to scale. 46 years of Dories, 307 of them. The last entry was dated October 1971 and read simply, "Last Dory, sound hull, good wood, going home." The third thing, alongside the chest in the book, was a small green velvet pouch drawn closed with a satin cord. Inside, when Vince carefully poured it onto the bench, was a single silver pocket watch chain, finely linked, with a small enamel medallion of San Francesco di Paola, the patron saint of Italian fishermen. Beside the pouch was the letter, folded once. The paper was the color of weak tea. Vince sat at the lofting bench with the lantern at his elbow, and he opened the letter and he read it. "To whoever finds this, my name is Salvatore Marino. I came to this country from a small village outside Palermo in Sicily in the year 1921, when I was 18 years old. I worked the cod schooners out of Gloucester for my first 3 years, and I apprenticed to a Norwegian dory builder named Olsen on the Annisquam in 1924. I bought this small shop in Lanesville in 1925 when I was 22, and I built dories in it alone, 307 of them, all of them by my own hand, from that year until 1971, when my hands could no longer hold a plane. I never married. I had no children of my own blood. My customers were my family. The young men who came down from Gloucester to order a dory from me, who stood on this floor while I drew their hull on the loft, who paid me in cash on a Saturday afternoon, and rowed their new dory out the doors and across the cove. Those young men were my sons. The silver chain is my father's. He was a fisherman in Sicily. He sent it to me with a letter in 1925 on the day I bought this shop, and the letter said in Italian, "Your work is a prayer. Do it well. Remember us." I never wore the chain. I could not. But I've kept it close to my work for 53 years. I did not trust the banks after the run of 29. So I saved what I could, year by year, and I put it where I knew it would be safe, behind the same pine that had held the lines of every dory I ever drew. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the cove has frozen and thawed many times without me. I do not know who you are. I do not know how you found this place. But I will tell you what I would have told a young man on his first day in this shop when I had a young man to tell. The wood does not care whether you are tired. The line does not care whether you are afraid. The work is the work. You loft the hull and you hand plane the strake, and you do it well because somewhere out there is a fisherman whose name you will never know, and he is rowing through a cold morning fog in a boat you built him. This shop was the joy of my life. I lit the first lamp here on a March morning in 1925. I closed the launching doors on an October evening in 1971, and I never came back because some things are too dear to come back to. Whoever you are, please open the doors. Please let the cove see a new hull come out of this shop again. The money is yours. The chain is yours. The book is yours. Use them for the shop. Use what is left for yourself. Live well. Be kind to the old men who took you in. Be patient with the young men who will need you to teach them. That is all I have. Salvatore Marino, October 1971. Vince read the letter twice. He folded it carefully along the original crease. He set it on the bench beside the lantern. He picked it up again. He set it down. He pressed the heel of his right hand against his eyes. He did not cry. His throat tightened and his eyes burned, but he did not let it come. He sat there at the lofting bench in the dim kerosene light, with his grandfather's leather photo album open beside him to the page of Salvatore on the deck of his dragger, and Salvatore Marino's letter at his hand. And he stayed that way for a long time. When he finally moved, he folded the letter into the back of the pattern book. He closed the cedar chest. He banked the lantern. He walked to the side door of the shop and stood there a moment with one hand on the frame, looking out at the cobblestone wharf and the gray cove. Then he locked the door behind him. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, was there a craft or a trade in your family that did not survive into your generation? The first thing he did was the lofting floor. He had learned, walking the perimeter of the building at low tide on the second morning, that the wide pine plank floor on which dories were drawn full scale before construction began had rotted in 3 places along the harbor side wall, where storm tides had leaked in for 30 years. Tony, when he came down to the cove the following Saturday, told him plainly that a dory shop without a sound lofting floor is no longer a shop. It is just a wooden building with a hole in the floor. The lofting floor was the heart of the place. Sally Marino had laid the original eastern white pine planks himself in the spring of 1925, and they had held the chalk line of every dory that had come out the doors for 46 years. So, through December and January, while the New England winter came down on the cove and the harbor froze along the granite jetties, Vince worked on the floor. He hired a retired carpenter named Aldo Bertucci, 81 years old, who had worked for the Gloucester boatyards in the 1970s, and who had once, as a young man, helped Sally Marino replank a section of this very floor in 1968. Aldo charged him only the cost of materials and an honest day's labor. Vince ordered fresh eastern white pine planks from a small lumber yard in Ipswich. He pulled up the rotted boards one cracked plank at a time with Aldo guiding him. He laid the new planks himself, the way Aldo showed him, square and tight, the seams butted clean, the edges hand-planed flush. He found the rhythm of the work in the third week. There was something in it that felt like prayer. The smell of fresh pine, the soft scrape of the hand plane against the new boards, the patient rebuilding of a floor that had been failing for 30 years. It felt, he thought, like setting a thing right that had been wrong for a long time. The first restoration milestone came in late February. The lofting floor was sound. The harborside wall had been reflashed. The shop no longer let in the tide. On a Tuesday afternoon, with Tony sitting on a coil of mooring rope inside the shop and watching, Vince had taken a piece of yard chalk and a long flat batten, and had drawn the first few feet of a small dory's keel line on the new floor. The line had been clean. The chalk had held to the pine. Tony had nodded slowly and had taken off his cap and had set it on his knee, and had said in his slow North Shore voice, "Well, there's a line." By March, word had begun to spread. Lanesville was a village of 1,300 year-round people, and a young Esposito boy with a brown chore coat and a $5 deed on Sally Marino's old shop did not remain a stranger in a village of 1,300 for very long. People began to walk down the cobblestone wharf on calm afternoons. There was a man named Sebastian Fort, 75, the retired captain of a Gloucester dragger who had ordered his first working dory from Sally Marino in 1969, when Sebastian had been a young deckhand of 19. Sebastian had walked down the wharf one Saturday in mid-March, carrying a covered dish of his late wife's eggplant parmigiana and a bottle of homemade red wine. He had sat on a wooden crate in the shop and had told Vince about the day he had picked up his finished dory from Sally, about the way Sally had refused to take the last $25 of the price because Sebastian had bought him a coffee on a cold January morning the previous winter when Sally had been working out a difficult set of curved frames. He kept that account in his head, Sebastian had said, eating slowly from his own dish. He would have known if I had owed him a quarter. But I had bought him a coffee, and so the dory was $25 cheaper. He did that for everyone. That is why we all came back. Vince had not known what to say to that, so he had not said anything. There was a man named Ignazio Russo, 80, retired postman of Lanesville for 42 years, who came down to the shop twice that spring, the second time with an envelope of color photographs he had taken with his own Kodak Instamatic in 1969 and 1970. The cobblestone wharf in summer, the cove at first light, 3 small dories tied up at a mooring, and one photograph of Sally Marino himself standing in the open seaward doors of the shop with his hand on the gunwale of a finished dory, an old Sicilian man in a wool sweater and a flat cap, half smiling at the camera. Vince asked Ignazio if he could keep the last photograph. Ignazio told him he had been hoping he would ask. Vince pinned it to the inland wall of the shop above the rack of hand planes, beside his grandfather Salvatore's photographs from the leather album, and they stayed there. There was a woman named Concetta Greco, 69, a Sicilian-American widow who ran a small Italian bakery on the Lanesville town wharf, and who had been Salvatore Esposito's neighbor in the old neighborhood for 28 years. She had begun walking down the cobblestone wharf to the shop every Saturday morning in mid-March with a paper bag of fresh-baked sfincione and a small jar of homemade orange marmalade. She had not stayed long the first 3 Saturdays. She would set the bag on the workbench, look around the shop with her sharp dark eyes, nod once, and walk back down the wharf to the bakery. The 4th Saturday she had stayed. She had sat on the wooden crate Tony usually sat on, and she had watched Vince hand-plane a fresh strip of cedar for the unfinished Dory, still on the sawhorse, and, after a while, she had said, "I knew your grandfather Salvatore for 28 years." Vince had stopped what he was doing. He had turned to look at her. "He came into my mother's bakery every Saturday morning before going down to the boat," Concetta had said. "He bought 1 cannoli for himself and 1 for the deck boy. He never came in for 2 cannoli. Always the same thing, every Saturday, for 19 years that I remember. The deck boy changed every 2 or 3 years, but the second cannoli did not." Vince had not known what to say to that, so he had not said anything. Concetta had stood up. She had brushed the flour from her apron. She had walked to the side door of the shop and stopped there a moment with one hand on the frame, looking out at the gray cove. Then she had walked back down the wharf to the bakery and had come back the next Saturday with another bag of sfincione, the way she had every Saturday before. By April, Vince had hired 2 more men to help with the heavier work. Aldo's son-in-law, who knew old marine carpentry, and a young man named Marco from the village, who needed work and who had watched Vince from the wharf for 2 weeks before he had finally come down and asked. Tony himself drove down 3 afternoons a week and sat on the coil of rope and gave instruction in the slow, sparing way of men who have done a thing for 60 years. By the end of April, the shop was sound. The lofting floor was new. The harborside wall was tight. The seaward launching doors had been re-hung on fresh iron hinges and could be opened to the cove. And on a clear, cool Saturday morning in early May, Vince stood at the seaward end of the shop and pushed open both leaves of the launching doors for the first time in 54 years, and the cool, salt wind off the cove came through the building, and the morning sun fell in a long, bright stripe across the new pine of the lofting floor. That's the thing about old places. They do not forget who walked their floors, and they do not forget what their walls were built to hold. A Dory shop that was built to draw hulls remembers hulls. A boy who was raised inside the small economy of an Italian fisherman's family in Gloucester, eldest of 3, who grew up in the smell of his mother's gravy and the sound of marine radio coming through the kitchen wall, remembers what work looks like, even after the boat is gone. Vince's father had owned a 38-foot wooden dragger. He had not owned her now. The bank had taken her on a Wednesday morning in March of Vince's senior year, and the family had moved into a Revere basement in November, and there had not been a way for any of them to put the boat back where she had been. But Vince's grandfather Salvatore's leather photo album still rode in the inside left pocket of the Carhartt, and the silver chain of San Francesco was now pinned to the inland wall above the rack of hand planes, and the lofting bench was new pine and held a fresh chalk line, and the launching doors of the merino shop opened onto the cove for the first time since 1971. He thought sometimes on the cool nights of his father, Joseph, who had worked the Donatella too for 13 years and had put 3 children through school on the catch, who had not known how to keep a boat when the quotas changed, who now sat at his brother's kitchen table in Revere with his hands flat on the wood, looking at the basement door. He thought of his father with no heat at all. Joseph had not known what his hands were for when the boat was taken, and the world had not given him time to learn. He thought more often of Tony, of Aldo Bertucci and Sebastian Forte and Ignazio Russo, of Concetta Greco, of Salvatore Marino, dead 30 years, whose letter Vince now kept folded in the back of the pattern book on the lofting bench. On a clear, warm evening in early June, Vince sat on the cobblestone wharf in front of the shop with a tin mug of black coffee in his hands and watched the sunset behind the granite headland to the west. The shop behind him was sound. The lofting floor would hold another 50 years. The kerosene lantern in the inland window was lit, warm yellow light spilling out across the wharf. There was a thin curl of wood smoke rising from the small flue of the cast-iron stove inside. Vincenzo Esposito was 19 years old and broke. He had $5 to his name, and he spent it on an abandoned Dory builder's boat shop on the small harbor cove of Lanesville, on the rocky northern shore of Cape Ann, just up the coast from Gloucester. It was the best $5 he ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to take these stories with you, we've put together a book of our favorites, and it comes with a full audio version you can listen to anytime. The link is in the description below. Tell us in the comments. Was there a craft or a trade in your family that did not survive into your generation? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.